And there's been a lot that's happened in those 6 months with Kody and Robyn and the kids. When I saw
Starspill USA presents. The room was not a studio. There were no stage lights fixed overhead, no producers whispering instructions into earpieces, no safety net of editing that could trim, polish, or reframe what came next. This was not a reunion. Special where tears could be timed for ratings and reconciliation rehearsed for applause. This was something entirely different. This was a chamber where truth wore robes and law carried a gavel heavy enough to silence years of carefully disguised noise. When the gavel came down, it struck not just wood against wood. It struck bone, struck memory, struck illusion. The sound cracked like a whip through the chamber, ricocheting off the paneled walls, shaking the very air. It did not echo. It expanded. It filled every corner until silence became unbearable. And then silence descended, suffocating and absolute. Not polite silence, not the silence of waiting. This was the silence of reckoning, the kind that presses against your lungs, demanding. You notice the absence of escape. It was the silence that told everyone present, this is not performance anymore. This is Judgment Day. The hallway outside still twitched with restless life. Cameramen adjusted tripods like soldiers bracing for battle. Reporters held microphones so close they nearly grazed their lips, whispering fevered preludes into invisible. Audiences waiting on the other side of the lens. Journalists scribbled notes with frantic urgency, their faces sharpened by the hunger of history. They were not here to record, they were here to feast. Inside, though, the air belonged to a different season. Curtains dampened the sunlight until only a muted haze lingered, a shadowed gold that clung to the judge's bench and cast everyone else in twilight. The benches creaked as bodies shifted, then froze, unwilling to break the hush. The air was taut, frozen, like a rope pulled so tight you could hear its fibers strain. Even the strongest smile, if attempted, would shatter beneath it. At the defense table sat Kody Brown. His suit was immaculate, tailored to precision, the kind of garment meant to signal control. But clothes are not armor against heartbeat. His chest hammered against the fabric. Each thud a betrayal of composure. His jaw was clenched so hard the muscles twitched beneath his skin. He sat forward, hands gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening with the pressure. But most of all, it was his eyes. Restless, darting, flickering, unable to settle. They strayed again and again, crossed the aisle to the other table. Christine, Janelle, Mary. They sat shoulder to shoulder. Not by design, but by gravity. Their silence was not emptiness, was dense. A silence with weight, perfected across years of endurance. It was the silence of slammed doors and whispered arguments. Of long drives taken to cool rage, of bruised voices that eventually learned the economy of withholding words altogether. It was the silence of veterans. It was iron. Behind them, slightly withdrawn, sat Robyn, a half-presence, tethered still to a past she could not yet release, yet pulled inexorably toward the truth she could no longer deny. Her eyes shimmered, tears balancing on the edge, trembling. For permission to fall, she was not aligned. She was not defiant. She was fractured, caught between the ghosts of loyalty and the demands of reality. The judge moved slowly, as though to remind the room he belonged to no one's tempo. He adjusted his glasses, turned the file with careful patience. Each page shift a whisper that sounded louder than a shout. Time itself seemed to bend around his hands. The clock grew heavy, its ticking intrusive, unbearable.
Everyone
knew that file contained more than paper. It contained fossils. It contained bones of arguments buried long ago, now unearthed. It contained maps of betrayal, records of money moved like contraband, contracts that whispered louder than screams. It was not ink, it was evidence. The world thought it understood this family. But the world had seen only what was staged, trimmed, packaged. The world had never touched this complaint. The world had not felt its weight, the thick paper, the legal ink, the courier's knock on the door, the signature demanded with no room for hesitation. This complaint was not story, it was storm. It was an atlas of shattered promises. Every slammed door cataloged. Every whispered fight numbered. Every late-night decision stamped. It was a museum of fractures, and the law does not soften. It does not yield to charisma, does not pause for charm, nor does it blink for tears. The law has no camera angles, no flattering edits. The law speaks only one language, evidence. And evidence, once fossilized on paper, does not recant. Christine's hands rested in her lap, knuckles pale, fingers interlaced so tightly her skin seemed to fade. But her eyes, they did not blaze. They did not simmer. They anchored. She was not here for vengeance. She was here for release, for peace. Beside her, Janelle's binder sat thick as a second spine. Tabs of every color marked years of labor. Receipts tucked into plastic sleeves, corners bent and stained by time. It was not a binder. It was a history book. It was survival pressed into pages. Mary sat still, so still that her silence became a verdict. For years she had been painted as outsider, dismissed as footnote, but now she sat inside her own boundary, firm, unmoving. Her silence was not absence, it was declaration, enough. And Robyn, her tears hovered like prisoners at the gates. She dabbed her eyes as though every drop needed approval, as though grief still required permission. She bore the weight of being the last one to believe repair was possible, the last one to imagine a miracle that never arrived. The judge lifted his gaze. His voice cut through the hush with steel. We begin with rules. No outbursts, no theatrics, no interruptions. This is not television. This is the court of law. The attorneys rose. Cody's lawyer first, polished, confident. His words flowed like velvet, smoothing edges until jaggedness almost seemed elegant. He called the charges exaggerated, bred from misunderstandings. He painted what looked like control as protection, what looked like manipulation as misunderstood love. He summoned the weight of fame, the scrutiny of cameras, the distortion of life lived in constant exposure. He painted Cody as flawed but devoted, a man building chaos from a heart to large. But words, however elegant, turned brittle against chronology. The plaintiff's attorney stood. The air shifted, colder now. She wasted no adjectives. She did not perform. She sharpened her words until they sliced. Caged voice. Unyielding is not about destruction. It is about breaking a pattern. Exhibit A appeared a thin contract, property relocation. Harmless to the naked eye, a mere paper. But lines and signatures carried blood in their veins. She laid it down on the podium like a blade, daring anyone to touch it. Love without consent, she said, is control. Financial decisions without accountability are not leadership. They are leverage. She requested the first witness. The judge nodded. Christine rose. Her steps echoed softly, a metronome in the silence. The bailiff extended the Bible. Her hand pressed firm, steady. She swore. She sat. Her voice quivered once, then found its strength pitched tight, unyielding. She began. She spoke of years painted bright for cameras but hollow in reality. She spoke of family meetings that were announcements, verdicts disguised as dialogue. She spoke of her daughter's question, "Why is love so exhausting for you, Mom?" And let the words linger like smoke. Exhausting, she explained, is when your voice claws for the microphone every single day. And still you are drowned out. She described midnight decisions, closed doors, conversations that were not conversations at all, but commands. She described money as faith and how every late discovery property sold. Loan rearranged, signature collected, drained that faith. Her words did not dramatize. They did not wound. They landed. It wasn't leadership, she said. It was pressure masquerading as protection. The room leaned closer. Even the walls seemed to breathe her words. No cough, no shuffle, no whisper dared intrude. Christine's testimony was not fire. It was not storm. It was colder than both, was a blade of truth pressed steady against years of performance. And when her words fell into the silence, they did not echo. They pierced. They pierced.
So much in the blink. Everything changed. And Kody withdrew, and then I withdrew, and we just withdrew.
The women who knew him best sat in silence as Kody finally found his voice. His words were not shouted, not even firm. They emerged quietly, almost trembling, as if he were defending himself not only to the court, but to the ghosts of his own decisions. "I didn't try to control," he said, his eyes lowered, his hands clasped before him. "I tried to hold this family together." He described leadership in a household that was unlike any other two adults could barely manage. A home, but here there were many adults, dozens of children, and the kind of chaos that demanded decisions like oxygen. Hesitation, he argued, meant lost opportunities. He spoke of love that, under the microscope of constant observation, sometimes wore the disguise of rules. "I bore the burden," he added, his voice catching slightly, "because someone had to." His tone was heavy, but his words were like rain sliding off the side of a mountain. The judge heard him the way mountains hear rain, unperturbed by quantity, alert only to rhythm and erosion. The judge's questions came measured, exact, deliberate. Why wasn't this decision documented? Why was that report relocated? Why were signatures taken after the occurrence instead of before? Each question was a stone dropped into the pond of Kody's defense, each ripple drawing everyone's attention back to the evidence itself. Evidence, after all, is obstinate. It does not bend to intention. It does not bend to memory. It only waits for acknowledgement. The judge was not cruel, nor was he indulgent. He was diligent, careful, methodical. The law, he reminded them silently, through his manner does not punish confusion, but it does not reward it either. Whatever these people had been in living rooms across America, characters, spectacles, subjects of fascination here, they were only people with paper trails. As the afternoon thinned and the sun angled lower, the light in the courtroom sharpened into something harsh. Shadows stretched longer. The warmth of daylight burned away. And in that harsher illumination, it was as if the courtroom itself wanted every illusion stripped bare. Years compressed into seconds before everyone's eyes. The day a wife realized she had signed up for something she didn't truly understand. The night a husband told himself pressure was love. The morning a child sat at the table and witnessed. Parents speaking over each other rather than to each other. This is what court does. It converts haze into labels. It converts anecdotes into chronology. It transforms, he said, she said, into what does the record show. When the break was called, no one lunged at one another. There were no explosive scenes, no cameras catching screaming faces. Instead, they stood apart, retreating into corners like boxers, revisiting their tapes before the next round. Christine's hand found Janelle's elbow, an anchor offered quietly. In the middle of the storm, Mary exhaled with such depth it seemed as though she had been holding that breath since the year before. Robyn sat with her eyes shut, her hands folded, lips moving in a soundless prayer or surrender. Was hard to tell which. Kody, meanwhile, fixed his gaze on the great seal above the judge's bench, glaring as if he could will it to blink and grant him a do-over. No one in that moment was a villain. They were simply people who had run out of ways to pretend the house wasn't already burning. When court reconvened, the judge reminded them with stern patience, this was not a show. This was not a platform for cameras. This was not about who would receive the better edit. This was about choices and consequences, consent and clarity, responsibilities and rights. He warned against interruptions, against glances thrown like darts, against the temptation to turn testimony into a performance. The room contracted with his words. Even the cameras waiting outside seemed to still, as though they too understood the shift in gravity. The last minutes of the day crept toward a cliff of silence. There would be other witnesses, more documents, more deliberate strolls through the labyrinth of the past. But in truth, the most important shift had already occurred. The silence that had sealed their fates for so many years had been broken. Truth had begun to speak in full sentences. Not because anyone here was flawless, but because everyone here was finished with being silent. The gavel lifted once more. For a suspended heartbeat, time itself seemed to hold its breath. And when it crashed, it was not only wood striking wood, was a door slamming shut on one life and a door swinging open toward another. They streamed out of the courtroom slowly, like mourners leaving a memorial or believers leaving a miracle. No one quite knew which it had been. The microphones outside waited like expectant birds, perched and eager, while the reverberations of that gavel still pulsed through rib cages. Cody smoothed his tie, stealing one last glance not at the judge, not at the lawyers, but at the bench where three women had sat shoulder to shoulder and the fourth just behind them. Each one clutched a version of him he could no longer inhabit. He didn't wave, he didn't speak. Sometimes the boldest act is silence, to let the truth finish its own sentence. Thus the day ended. Everyone lighter, everyone heavier. Lighter, because their words now lived outside their bodies. Heavier, because once spoken, words cannot be unsaid. Tomorrow there would be cross-examinations and rebuttals, explanations and justifications, perhaps even apologies and moments of mercy. But tonight, as courthouse lights flickered out one by one, the lesson was unyielding. Love that does not listen becomes a lecture, and families cannot survive on lectures alone. The subpoena had dragged anguish into light, and the light, however, merciless, revealed truth. Whatever verdict would come, the destiny had already shifted because silence no longer owned them. Christine had barely stepped down from the witness stand when the murmur of the courtroom surged, restless as a tide against rocks. Her words hung in the air, dense and unmovable, like smoke refusing to clear. The judge tapped his gavel softly, for order, but the resonance of her testimony clung to the walls, soaked into wood and marble, impossible to contain. Then it was Janelle's turn. She rose with her binder in hand, her jaw set in quiet determination. For a flicker of a moment, even Cody straightened in his chair, as though bracing for impact. If Christine had spoken to the heart, Janelle was about to speak to the ledger. The oath was given quickly. Janelle's hand shook faintly as it pressed against the Bible. Not from fear, but from the weight of knowing this was her chance to finally lay bare the frustration she had recorded for years. She gripped her binder like a soldier would grip a shield, not to attack, but to defend, to protect the truth she had preserved line by painstaking line. Settling into the witness stand, she inhaled once, then opened the first tab. Her eyes met the attorney representing her and the other wives, and with a steady voice, she began. She was asked about her role in the family's financial affairs. Janelle adjusted her glasses, her voice calm, even unflappable. I was the one who handled the day-to-day. I balanced what came in and what went out. I tracked expenses, food, bills, the kids' needs, travel. I tried to keep it afloat. Her tone held no bitterness, only fatigue carved deep by repetition. But when it came to the bigger decisions, properties, investments, loans, she was not consulted until after the decisions were made. Then she turned a page. This, she said, sliding it toward the judge, is an example. Money was transferred from account to account. I didn't know until weeks later. By then, I had already been trying to pay the bills. Her finger tapped a highlighted section before flipping to another tab. Here is a loan against property. I wasn't there when it was signed. I discovered it only when the paperwork arrived in the mail. Her words, like Christine's, did not seek to accuse. Tay sought to reveal. They turned smoke into stone, exhaustion into evidence. And in that moment, Janelle did not sound like a wife or a cast member. She sounded like what she had always been, the keeper of the ledger.
And the exposure that her kids were still getting. Garrison and Gabriel are both existing.
Cody squirmed in his seat, his expression hardening with every word Janelle spoke. His attorney leaned toward the bench and protested in a calm, practiced voice, insisting these were miscommunications. That his client had every right as head of the family to make such decisions in times of crisis. But the judge, unshaken, overruled the objection with a firm hand. The papers were entered into evidence, he said simply. And so Janelle continued, her voice unwavering. She described how the children would ask her for money for simple things, school events, books, shoes, and how too often she found herself dipping into her personal savings just to keep things afloat. Every time she turned to Cody for clarity about the accounts, he would offer vague reassurances. Trust me, he always said, she recounted, her voice dipping lower. I know what I'm doing. Then she paused and added, but trust requires clarity. Trust requires partnership. The courtroom leaned in. No one shuffled. No one coughed. Janelle wasn't dramatic. She didn't have to be. Her reality was systematic, laid bare with precision. Every receipt, every bank statement, every dollar misplaced tallied into something heavier than numbers. It tallied into dishonesty. When asked how this had impacted her personally, she hesitated. Her gaze softened, her lips tightened before finally partying. I lost myself, she said, her words dropping like stones in still water. I became more accountant than wife. I became the one repairing what I had not broken. I carried this weight in silence because voicing concerns only brought turmoil. But silence it became a cage. Then, with quiet courage, she shut the binder and looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, she said firmly, I don't come here to destroy him. I come because the truth must be told. Because the children deserve better examples. Because love should never require blind submission. Her words lingered heavy, pressing down on Cody like a boulder. He shifted uneasily, whispering into his attorney's ear. His jaw locked, his shoulders tense. For years, he had been the loudest voice in every room, the master of every scene, the one who dictated how stories were told. Now, in this courtroom, his voice was no longer the dominant one. The others had become louder, sharper, undeniable. The lawyer thanked Janelle and closed her testimony. The judge nodded, permitting her to step down. As she walked past Cody, she refused to glance his way. That silence between them roared louder than any argument ever could. The bridge had burned long ago. And then, Mary, a palpable tension swept through the room as she rose. For years, she had been cast as the outsider, the wife at the edges, present and absent all at once. But as she approached the stand, her eyes carried no wavering, her voice no hesitation. She swore her oath and folded her hands atop the rail. What would you like to tell the court? Her attorney asked gently. Mary gazed at the judge first, then briefly allowed her eyes to drift toward Cody. I want to discuss promises, she began softly. Her words were deliberate, each one placed like a stone along a narrow path. She spoke of the early days, when Cody's charm filled every room, when his dreams stretched endlessly. When she believed in those dreams enough to weave her own life around them. But over time, she explained, those promises changed shape. Gentle guidance hardened into rules. Unity soured into control. He used love as a promise, Mary said, her voice breaking but steady. And then he handled that promise like a leash. The words struck the room like a sudden wind. They weren't shouted, but they didn't need to be. The judge's face remained still, but his pen scratched furiously across his notepad. Robyn dabbed at her eyes, trembling. while Christine pressed her lips tight, as if fighting her own tears. Mary went on. She confessed moments when her thoughts were dismissed, when her attempts at reconciliation were rejected. She admitted her own failures, her regrets, her desperate fight to grasp something that had already slipped away. But then her tone shifted, her voice sharpening. "I was quiet for too long," she declared. "I believed silence would bring harmony, but silence only shelters the one in power. I will be quiet no more." The room froze, giving her words the space they deserved. Even the air itself seemed to pause in respect. When she was thanked and excused, she nodded with calm dignity and returned to her seat, a woman who had finally spoken her truth. Cody leaned forward, his attorney ready to call him up at last. But before he could speak, the judge leaned into his microphone. His voice sliced through the tension like steel. "Mr. Brown, the testimony we've heard today is not about small disputes. They reveal patterns of control, patterns of secrecy, patterns of imbalance. You will have your chance to respond. But hear this. This court is not a stage. This court is not a debate. This court is a place of accountability." The warning landed harder than any testimony. Cody nodded stiffly, his eyes flicking back to the women. But they did not look at him with love, or with anger, or even with longing. They looked at him with determination. In that look, he saw what he had never truly believed would come the day when his voice no longer carried the final word. Afternoon adjourned, but the air in the room remained electric, charged, heavy with what had been spoken. The wives departed in a line, their spines straight, their steps steady. Robyn lingered behind, caught between loyalty and the weight of truths she could no longer ignore. Cody stayed at the table, one hand covering his forehead, his lawyers. Words a muffled hum. When he finally stood, he did not resemble the confident patriarch America had once known. He looked like a man watching everything he thought he held together unraveled piece by piece. For the first time, the courtroom did not merely contain him, it revealed him. And no charisma, no past authority could silence the echo of the voices that had finally risen against him. When he did speak, his voice trembled with the pressure of years. "I was the one who supported this family," he insisted, his tone swelling in desperation. He recounted sleepless nights, endless responsibilities, the suffocating glare of public judgment. He argued that his actions were not about control but about survival. That without his leadership, chaos would have consumed them all. His words were passionate, almost frantic. But they crashed against the wall already built, the wall of Christine's pain, Janelle's evidence, Mary's truth. Even Robyn, his last ally, watched him with eyes clouded by doubt. The judge leaned forward, again his voice sharp. "Do not confuse control with love," he said. The silence that followed was absolute. Christine and Janelle exchanged a quiet look of gratitude. Mary straightened, her shoulders lighter. Cody's credibility, piece by piece, dissolved beneath the judge's questions. Why were records hidden? Why were signatures taken after decisions? Why were finances concealed? Each hesitation in his reply carved a deeper wound in his defense. Robyn's tear slid silently down her cheek as she realized the man she had defended was being stripped bare, excuse by excuse. Finally, the gavel struck, closing the day. The sound thundered through rib cages, final and unrelenting. Christine's face held quiet triumph. Janelle's resolve glowed steady. Mary's relief radiated like dawn after a long night. Robyn sat broken, caught in the split between love and betrayal. And Cody leaned forward, his shoulders bowed under the burden of what was no longer a denial, but truth. Outside, cameras flashed. Microphones swarmed. Inside, the voices lingered still, carved into wood, etched into memory. A family once bound by silence had spoken, and nothing would ever return to what it was. For the Browns, the verdict itself was still to come. But the message had already been delivered. Love without respect becomes a prison, and silence is the lock. On this day, that lock had finally been broken. And as the courthouse lights dimmed, one lesson remained unyielding, echoing not only in that room, but beyond it. Families cannot survive on control, they survive only on trust. This was the day the Browns stopped being a story and became a reckoning. And this story, this reckoning, was brought to you by Starspill USA.